Coming up next, Sitting at 30 takes you downtown for the weekly luncheon meeting of the City Club of Portland. Live weekly coverage of City Club is produced through the facilities of Portland Cable Access. Now we join the City Club for this week's program.
As you may remember from my previous comments, I'm greatly disturbed by an apparent lack of succession of a sense of civic values in the rising generation. Early in July, I invited a task force of young people to address the issue and to prepare recommendations to the board on how the City Club might address their interests more effectively. They've taken up the challenge with great enthusiasm and have been grilling their peers on their values and perceptions and are well on their way to compiling some valuable conclusions. Today we examine the same issue but from a different angle. And today, as we're still reeling from the sheer horror and unknown consequences of last week's events, the certainty of our values that underlie our democracy have never been more important. Today, we focus on civic activism as defined by three rising young community leaders. How do they see the focus changing among their peers? The young citizens known as the Generation Xers. Sharing their perspectives today are Laura Bridges, Chair of X-PAC and aide to Multnomah County Chair Diane Lynn, Carolyn Scott, Information Services Project Manager for Providence Health Systems, and Eric Friedenwald-Fishman, Creative Director and President of Metropolitan Group. But first, as usual, some announcements. Next Friday, we turn our focus on the state of Portland's public schools with Interim Superintendent Jim Scherzinger and Chair of the School Board, Debbie Menashe. That'll be on Friday, September the 28th here at the MAC. All of the club's issue committees are beginning their new session of meetings this month, and meeting schedules are printed in this week's bulletin. So if you have questions about how to get involved, please call the club office. Now's the time to join and get in on the planning of the year's activities. We'll soon be publishing an updated membership directory, so please check your address, phone number, and email listed correctly, and there's a form in the bulletin you can use to correct those if need be. Next Tuesday, there'll be a tugboat tour of the Ross Island with Growth Management and Environmental Committee, and they've graciously offered the few remaining seats to any members who'd like to join them. So if you would like to do that, let Suzanne know. There are flyers about it on the tables. At www.pdxcityclub.org, you can gain access to research reports, past club program presentations, upcoming events, and membership information. Our board host today, sitting at the far end of the table, is Carol Witherell, member of the Board of Governors and Professor of Education at Lewis and Clark College. She will ask the first question of our speakers. Following Carol's question, we'll open the program to questions from City Club members in the audience. As usual, please line up behind the microphone before Carol has finished her question so we can make the most of our speakers' time. Identify yourself as a City Club member and remember to ask your question in 30 seconds. Broadcasting of City Club program this quarter is made possible in part by corporate underwriting from Legacy Health Systems, Pope & Talbot Incorporated, and Washington Mutual Savings Bank. We're most grateful to them for their support. Before becoming aide to Multnomah County Chair Diane Lynn, Laura Bridges worked with American Red Cross and with the Tobacco Free Coalition for Washington County. Her first campaign made her a crossing guard at an elementary school in 1978. She's been at it ever since. Since then, she's been active with NARAL and with Oregon Women's Political Caucus. Laura is currently chair of X-PAC, a Portland-based group committed to building a new generation of political leaders and community activists. Next to her is Carolyn Scott, who joined Providence Health Systems 4 years ago as an administrative fellow, having worked as a health education specialist with women and children and as an independent living skills instructor at the YMCA. Now managing projects in Providence's Information Services Division, she has a broad view of young people in Portland. Carolyn holds a master's in public health from San Diego State University and a BSc in health sciences from Cal State at Hayward. Immediately to my left is Eric Friedenwald-Fishman, who's one of the most energetic people I know. Besides being president and creative director of Metropolitan Group, a social marketing company specializing in public-private partnerships, marketing and fundraising, he's on the adjunct faculty at PSU's Institute for Nonprofit Management. He's active on the board of trustees at Willamette University. He's vice chair of the board of directors for the Regional Arts and Cultural Council, and he's marketing committee chair for Portland Center Stage. Well, rather than sticking to the usual panel format, we thought that we'd share a conversation today, and I must say I'm delighted not to have this great wooden obelisk next to me here. This seems altogether more civilized. So let me start off by throwing down the gauntlet for our panel with a question directed at Laura. Last November, fewer than 1 in 9 eligible voters under the age of 34 actually voted. Either they don't care or they don't find the issues relevant, or at least that's how it appears. Laura, X-PAC is perhaps most sharply focused on the issue of political involvement by the young. Are we dealing with widespread apathy?
No, I really believe we are not. Our generation volunteers at a higher rate than almost any other generation before us. Here locally, you see a lot of groups, younger groups, that are directly involved in activism in their community. You have X-PAC, for one. You have a group called CNRG, which is a group of young people who have created a community network over the internet to provide leadership and opportunities for involvement in the community. We also have Generation, which is another wonderful young group of young professional and political professionals that focus on involvement in the Latino community. And as well, I did a little research before I came here today, and we actually have a really encouraging number of Generation Xers that actually hold office throughout the state. We have at least about 10 of them who are in the Oregon legislature. We have one of them in the room today, which is Commissioner Eric Stinn, who's also one of the founding members of X-PAC, as well as one on the Multnomah Board of Commissioners. I really truly believe we are involved, we are engaged, we are just doing it in non-traditional ways that may not be noticeable or recognizable to other generations.
Any comment?
Well, I would actually agree that you've got this mythos out there that says it's, what's wrong with your generation? You're a bunch of slackers, and I think that's wrong. And I think that actually perpetrating of that myth might make it come true. So we should be very careful. That being said, I do think there is something that creates a signal of grave danger that 1 in 9 of us voted this last time around. It sends a signal that there is something amiss. I guess my question is something amiss with my generation, or is something amiss with the overall system and what the signals that are being sent, that 1 out of 9 people said, yeah, I better do that, but 8 out of 9 people said, those issues aren't relevant to me, you're not speaking to me. I mean, look at this last presidential campaign. I mean, how many messages were aimed at anyone under the age of 55? I've had the chance to work professionally as a campaign manager, and obviously your job is to win 50% plus one. And you look at the polling, you say, let's aim all of our money and all the issues we talk about at the likely voters. And you end up with a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you were under the age of 55 this election, you said, well, clearly I shouldn't vote because they're not talking about anything that matters to me. In fact, they're making it pretty clear that I'm irrelevant. So I think there's an issue there.
No, I do agree with you on that, although I firmly believe that it's also our responsibility to see past that, which is why I think a lot of us are getting involved directly in our community. I think our generation, we go for direct action. You have this prevalent cynicism that, our vote does not count, but, when I go out and read for SMART, or when I go out and give blood, or any number of activities that our generation, and probably many of you in the room, participate in as well, that's direct, immediate impact in our community. We can see that. It's a positive right away result rather than, we may vote and then we just don't see the impact and we just don't see it making a difference.
Right, and I think Laura brings up a very interesting perspective in exactly defining what is civic engagement. I think very often the traditional view is that we define that as voting or getting membership into local organizations. But I think some of the younger people might also define that as deciding which company will they work for. Will they work for someone who participates in ethic or business practices that they don't agree on? And very often, some of the civic engagement that young folks do currently might be seen as kind of passive, or as something that, like Laura mentioned earlier, something that yields those immediate results. And not to minimize the fact that we also need to figure out why aren't young folks voting. That's true in of itself, but we also need to find out why they're not voting. And where they are engaged civically, how were we able to get them there and find that they are engaged. And I also think is a really important, something that we really need to notice, the difference between volunteerism and civic engagement. Because interestingly enough, volunteerism has increased sharply over the last few years. Very high numbers of young folks are involved in volunteerism, doing that one-on-one, more immediate kind of contact with people. But I think it's arguably so that those kind of efforts don't have as much of an impact on us globally and on larger society. And I think if we're able to engage young folks in that way in civic engagement, that they will have a more of a stakeholder in the future and what impact they will have on the long term. But it's a matter of identifying what those needs are and what their passion is and what drives them.
Well, Carolyn, you just used the word civic engagement, and I guess to me that word is a pretty critical word. I mean, this was called, not your grandfather's civics, and I was thinking about, what do we mean when we say civics? And civics is about the rights and the responsibilities of citizenship. And I guess it's, I am thrilled that we are all volunteering as much as we do, and I think that's one of the most important things we can do. If you want to be civically engaged, you get up and you get out there and you do the direct work. But I also think that we've lost something, and I don't think it's just our generation. I think we've lost something in this country in terms of a value of how important it is to be a citizen, of this idea that we have a social contract, of this idea that there's something more in it for us than there is in it for me. And I think that that's something that we really have to start cranking up the volume on. We are involved in different ways. Things are different now than they were 50 years ago in terms of how many hours people work, in terms of how people define themselves, more by their profession or by their job than by other ways. We're a mobile society. We don't have necessarily multiple generations of a family in one city. So where is it that we are putting forth those values of how important it is to be a good citizen and to exercise those rights and responsibilities? How many workplaces are saying, hey, a part of what we're going to look at when we're hiring and when we're promoting and when we're doing your annual performance review is your engagement in the community. And on top of that, how many of them are saying, and we're going to support your engagement in the community with time off to do that, with financial resources to follow you and invest in the areas that you're involved. I mean, we have to look at, we designed a bunch of social structures for civic engagement a couple hundred years ago, and they work great. But in the last 50 years, a lot of the basic social structures have changed, but we haven't necessarily changed the rules or the ways in which we encourage and engage people in civic engagement.
Right, and you did bring up a good point about incentive. I read a statistic somewhere that I thought was very interesting, and that half of our workforce today has never lived through a recession. So feeling an incentive and the passion to want to, well, until maybe last week, that is, but until we're able to define exactly what that driving force is, I think we still have a challenge before us. So I think that's definitely something we need to look at.
Although what I find disturbing is that we do need to incent this sort of behavior. Well, I think it's great that employers can encourage us, that they can give time off, that they can look at it in a performance review. What I find disturbing as a culture, as a society, is that we need an incentive to participate. Mm-hmm. And I don't really have an answer to give there. I just kind of want to throw that out as something that I find really, really distirbing as I get around.
It's disturbing. I agree with you. It's disturbing if it needs to be an incentive. Mm-hmm. I guess what I'm wondering is how do we arrive at values? How is it that the people sitting in this room, clearly someplace in your top 5 list, I'll make a bet, how many people in the top 5 things that are important to you are being a citizen of this community and being engaged in this community? How many people in this room? Is that within your top 5 values? Okay, well, we don't represent necessarily the entire world. Where did that come from? That got placed in us somehow. Somebody taught us that. It was our parents, or it was our school, or it was our first job. I mean, I know this morning I was thinking about it, and my parents, boy, did they hammer that into us in terms of how important that was, but also teachers that I had. didn't just teach the subjects that we were being taught at school, but taught how important being a citizen of that school and your community were. It was absolutely at the core essence of my college education. And then in my first job out of college, my first week on the job, my boss said, hey, come with me. There's this really horrible thing that's happening. This group called the Oregon Citizens Alliance is putting a ballot measure on the Oregon ballot called Measure 8 in 1988, and it's going to legalize discrimination. And our company has bought a table at an event to fight this thing, and I want you to come with me. And after that event, I ended up volunteering to help raise money to fight that campaign, and my company gave me support to do that, gave me time to do it. It wasn't an incentive, but it was having lots of places that were saying this is of value. And I'm curious in our society if we're doing enough of that. I don't think we talk about citizenship or civics, and I guess I'd like us to be sending a signal that says, you want to be cool, you want to be a citizen. So.
Something else that I think is important to note, though, is that the complexity of the world that we live in today, there were very often during the 60s and even before that, well into the 70s or so, there was a common cause that people rallied around. There was the civil rights movements. There was Vietnam. Today, those issues, some of those issues are still there, those issues out there that people can rally around, but they're really complex. And it's hard I guess, for people to feel that they're able to put their arms around them. And very often, I think, when we have information overload, we tend to become paralyzed. And on the flip side of that, I think if we simply ask, go to young folks and those who are going to be the future leaders and find out exactly what it is that drives them. We realize that there are 10 different choices that you have, or in this case, maybe thousands of choices, literally, for the things that are going on. But if you had to choose the top 3, what would they be? And support them in those things, in those efforts.
No,
And I think because of the complexity, we have minimized that discussion of civic engagement and bringing young people to meetings that are going to have an impact on our community, a direct impact.
I definitely agree with Carolyn on that. As our days get more and more busy, as we each are having to multitask more and more, working into the evening, that's going to become, I think, even more of a critical piece. But we all need to actually make that commitment to do it. We need to make the commitment to stop, figure out, well, what am I going to do to bring up the next generation? What sort of opportunities can my company or my organization or my government entity, what can we do to bring them up, provide them with meaningful mentorship opportunities, meaningful opportunities to learn more, to become part of a decision-making process on policy. It's going to take some work, and it's always hard to be the first one to start, but I think it needs to start somewhere, and I think this room is a really good place to do that. And I firmly believe that if just a few people start, we make a culture in our city to where civic engagement is part of the norm. We are getting so isolated. You mentioned technology. In our homes, we go from our cubes to our cars to our homes, where we're just insulating ourselves, and we're missing out on a lot of community meetings, a lot of, even block parties. How many people have seen a block party in the last 10 years? We're not engaging. We're not, my point is we're not engaging with younger people. We're not even engaging with our neighbors. And I think we need to start getting back to that and, actually having the courage to be the one to start that.
I guess my concern is that the majority of young people we're talking about, we never see here. We never see in our day-to-day lives. And those are the most difficult to get at. Do you think that we are unwittingly raising barriers that prevent their engagement in some respect because of our own ideas of how engagement should occur?
I think that there are a lot of examples where that is the case, and there certainly are probably just as many examples where it's not. But for me, a point was just made about how people are multitasking and working more. If you look at the statistics, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, when a lot of our social systems were created, many households had one person working full-time and one person not working full-time. Now most households have both people working full-time, or only one parent in the household who's trying to not only keep their job down, but make sure that their kids are being raised. And that question of where's that time for the civic engagements? How many of the people we're talking about can make a new meeting downtown to talk about civics? What time do we schedule our board meetings? Are people appointed to a board of directors and need to make a commitment to being at a meeting every month, or are we appointing people who are partners or significant others to share that role so one person can always be there? I mean, we really do have to look at what are the barriers that we're putting in place in terms of how do people engage? I mean, Hands On Portland's a group that's been incredibly successful with the part of success we've talked about in terms of volunteer activity. And one of the things they did is they said, you know, many volunteer activities work in the realm of you commit for a year and you have to be there every week and you have to make plans long in advance. And we all know that most people decide what they're going to do this weekend when A&E hits the doorstep on Friday morning. Let's make volunteering just as easy and let's make it just as immediate. So I think we do need to think about what are some of those barriers. I don't think that's the only problem, but I think it's worth trying to remove as many of them as possible.
I think another barrier, and I think those of you that track the legislative session may have seen that come out in spades this last time. There were many pieces of legislation, mercifully none of them passed, that would have drastically hampered the ability for not just young people, but a lot of working class people to have access to the polls, to the ability to cast a vote. And I think it's tied into that, but I think we also need to also be watching what our legislature is doing and making sure that laws are not being passed that are going to restrict a whole portion of our community from being able to actually be engaged.
I agree, and at the same time, I think we also need to challenge our paradigm or our current way of thinking, because we do have existing resources now and public dollars that are focused on young folks, but very often those dollars see children as problems, and those dollars go towards prevention efforts, teen pregnancy prevention programs, drug prevention programs, crime prevention programs, and the dollars are there and the support is there for those programs. If we put our young folks and our youth in the position of being a problem, and we see that we have to throw dollars at prevention because they are problems. But if we see them as civic leaders or as future leaders, it gives them the opportunity to show their creativity and their innovation and see themselves as leaders. And once we change our mindset and our approach towards youth, they really do, amazingly enough, rise to the occasion. And I think we need to look at existing resources, and we don't have to reinvent the wheel or create a new idea, but look at the current resources that we have. How are we channeling those dollars, and how might we think differently? What are some strategies that we might use with our existing resources that might encourage civic engagement and take down some of those barriers that do exist?
You know, another kind of a barrier that has occurred to me is one in terms of what is it that you see happening in terms of actual policy. You know, the generation we're talking about, they became adults in terms of working adults really in the last 10 to 12 years. And for most of that time period, if we look at Oregon, a lot of the basic discourse and debate was not set by our elected leaders and was not set by leadership in the community. It was set by Bill Sizemore and his cronies. And if we look at what's happened over that period of time, it's been a period of time of pretty devastating disinvestment. We got lucky. You know, the stock market was doing great during that time, and we were able to grow ahead of this. That's maybe not the case anymore. But the key is we've been struggling. We have not been investing the way we should be in schools. We've not been investing the way we should be in transportation. And for 10 years, I'm looking for it. It might have happened and I missed it. But where has been the voice that said, you know, Oregon's better than this. We should change the debate from how much we're going to cut and what new land use reform we're going to pass that tears away that which is the heritage of this state. But what are we going to do to actually restore full funding of one of the world's best education programs? What are we going to need to do to invest in higher ed? And I think to some degree, if from the time you were 21 or 22 until the time you were 35, what you saw was the discourse and debate that was happening on a statewide basis being primarily around what's going to get cut and trying to spend huge energy fighting something bad from happening, as opposed to saying, hey, civics and politics are about leadership and moving things forward and making this a better place to live. I can see where people see that as a barrier and say, maybe I'm going to check out of that.
Exactly. We had an earlier conversation before we actually met here today, and we were talking about the word sustainability. And that gets bandied around a lot when it comes to the environment, when it comes to our communities. But I think we need to look at leadership in a sustainable way, too. where are we going to be in the next 10 years if we don't start looking at and bringing up the younger kids? So I think we would all be wise to look at leadership development with the same eye that we look to the environment, that we look to urban renewal, that we look to transportation, that we think of the word sustainability when we do think of leadership development as well.
Carolyn, you mentioned volunteerism earlier, and by implication, you talked about the fragmentation that's occurred in engagement of young people. That there are so many hundreds of alternative activities vying for their attention. Maybe that has tended to make a lot of effort less visible than it might be. Not so very long ago, the church was enormously important in the way our society was put together. And one of the first things you just found out about somebody is, well, what church did you go to? And that had a lot to do with where they learned the civic values that Eric was talking about. Do you see that a refocusing, perhaps, on the way ahead, the way we can make things better, as being a way to reassemble these fragmented groups?
I think first and foremost it's just acknowledgement that we do have a lot of things vying for our attention, and acknowledging that fact, I think, is the first thing. And then simply asking, what is it that drives you? What is your passion? What is it that would make you want to make you wake up each day and spend extracurricular time, fighting towards or supporting or building up? And again, I think it goes back to trying to define exactly what is civic engagement. Very often I think most people probably have gotten these emails where you're told to email your congressman if you want, to address an issue. How many people follow through on that, and how are you able to measure that? Is that something we want to look at? Would someone consider the fact that they recycle as a form of civic engagement? So those are the kind of things, again, where I think that we need to challenge. I think that we need to challenge our current way of thinking.
Well, and it's also, you were talking about recycling, and that's I think, a really interesting example in one of the other big things that's changed. When I was a kid, we moved here because there was this thing being cleaned up called the Willamette River. And boy, it's amazing how history repeats itself. We're about to clean up the Willamette River. But at that time, and all over America, when people looked at that issue of clean water, we were able to say, what we need to do is we need to get these factories to, turn off that pipe that's dumping bad stuff into the river and deal with a few key places where there's industrial pollution happening, and then the problem will be solved. And that's an easy thing for people to rally around and to say, we support that. Now, government, you go fix that. And business, you go fix that. And today, if we're looking at truly actually trying to clean up the Willamette River, we've learned about this very complex thing we need to come up with a better name for it so it's understandable, of non-point source pollution. But basically, it's not about 50 or 100 or 100,000 pipes being turned off. It's about 200 million Americans saying, boy, what I put on my lawn, when I run the water when I brush my teeth, do I need to go in a single auto car trip, and because each time I touch on the brakes, it's putting metals onto the road that eventually wash into the river, and it's millions and millions of actions by millions and millions of people that contribute to these problems. And so to some degree, we're also living in a time where the solving of problems take millions of fragmented little individual actions and choices, as opposed to being able to say, okay, there's the problem, here's the solution, we've agreed, now you go fix it for us. And so you actually need both. You need the ability for people to say, yes, I'm going to take responsibility in many, many, many small ways that won't be visible, but that will do my part for recycling, for clean water, for education, etc. But we also do need to find a place where people come together and have that sense of civic engagement, of being a part of a community addressing a problem and an issue.
And I think in your example, it's also important for people to feel that they are making a difference and to have some measurable outcomes. So I think there needs to be a way to figure out how can we, we realize that there are these million little variables that are happening, but how can we somehow bring those things together and realize that we have made a difference?
I think what we're looking for is a critical mass on this. That I think if we actually today had a flip chart and we started naming off all the different ways that each one of us make a difference in our community every day, we'd be quite amazed. If we just tried to harness that energy into solving the problems together, it would just be amazing. I think I want to go back to an earlier point about how do we get the young people engaged. I think one of them is, you mentioned ask. I'm going to use an example here with X-PAC. I've been involved in X-PAC for about 4 or 5 years now, and in that time, I can only recall being asked once if a young person would be interested in serving our government on a board, on a commission. We've always had to go out and track it down for our members, which I think is wonderful that we do. I think it's very critical that while we're all out doing our individual things, we're remembering to actually ask other people in as well.
And that's such an important point because, if you look at this question of, are young people invisible, and you made the point, Carolyn, about that often they're viewed as a problem. And really, if you look at it, the most powerful thing, I work in a marketing firm, and the most powerful marketing is when one person who knows somebody asks another person to do something. And the reality is, are we all making the time in our lives and making a priority in our lives to say, the people that I know that are young, however you want to define young, I'm personally going to ask them to get involved and engaged. I'm going to make sure that around election time I'm talking about voting, and I'm sitting down and talking about, hey, do you want to talk about these issues? That I'm doing it at work, that I'm doing it at the synagogue, that I'm doing it in my neighborhood, that I'm making sure that I'm taking the effort to ask somebody if they'll be involved and telling them that it's personally important to me that you as an individual are involved, and I want to help you and I want to support you in doing that. And obviously the only way you can do that is if you're walking the talk yourself and make sure that you're involved. So.
Exactly. Actually, anecdotally, from the last general election, I believe it's Yale that's doing the study right now. They are actually phoning the 18 to 34 demographic and if they voted, ask them, why did you vote? And a lot of them said, it was because I was asked. I was asked by a peer. They actually called me. They came up to me. They made it a priority. They made it relevant to me. I don't underestimate the power of actually being asked to do something.
And I think the point that the two of you brought up is what that does, if each one of us take the responsibility of reaching out and asking someone as an individual, is it divides the responsibility among the youth. Because what happens currently very often is word gets out that there's this amazing teenager, this amazing high school senior that's great, an excellent speaker and has passion, and that's the person that every group is going to call on to participate in whatever their activities are. And there's, when you meet one, there's thousands of others that's just like that one. And I think if we each can take that individual responsibility that both Eric and Laura mentioned is to approach young people, that division of labor will happen, and you'll see an expansion of efforts.
I think this might be a good opportunity for you to ask your question, Carol.
Thank you for a most enjoyable beginning to a conversation here. And it's wonderful to see the high schoolers who came in. Welcome to all of you. Here's my question. Many Americans, actually of all generations, are quite distrustful of or cynical about government these days, thinking that a more direct than representative form of government would be more democratic. Others are deeply frustrated with the corporatization of the civic and political process as they see elections and the initiative process manipulated by large moneyed interests. And I'm borrowing in part from David Broder's talk to us last spring here at one of our forums. What would each of you see as the single most important way to rebuild our trust in government and our sense of being part of a very large, complex, multi-layered civic process?
Good luck.
Well, I'll jump on that high horse right away and say, and this is going to make me really unpopular, but our government does a great job with so many things. I mean, we don't talk about our social contract. I was livid way back when the first healthcare reform thing crashed because there were all these ads saying, oh my God, it'll raise the price of a piece of pizza if we give health insurance to minimum wage workers. I'm like, minimum wage workers should have health insurance, and I'm willing to pay more for a piece of pizza. And we get into this context where we start talking about, well, government doesn't do anything for me. I'm going to vote for property tax reform because I'm not on welfare and my kids aren't in JDH, and, government doesn't do anything for me. That's a crock. Do you drive on the streets? If you are a middle-class person who supposedly does not utilize government services, you use them the most. If you're an employer and a manager, who educated those people that you're hiring? Did the streetlights turn on this morning when you were driving to work and it was still dark? When you use the state parks to go on vacation because you can afford to go on vacation? Are you paying the full cost of maintaining those parks? Oh, you go hunting. What do you pay for a hunting tag? What does it actually cost to manage those resources? We've got to stop being shy about talking about what government does well, what civil society does well, and we need to make people aware that we are proud to be citizens, proud to have a social contract, and life would be pretty lousy if we didn't have it.
Carolyn, you want to follow that?
As I was thinking about this program today, I identified kind of 5 rules of engagement, and I think this will address Carol's question. One, as I've said many times this afternoon, is find out. Find out exactly what it is, where the interests are, what the passions are, and then once you know that, reach out. Go out to those individuals that you're interested in engaging. Go on their turf, in their space, and come with specific offers of assistance. Be very specific about what it is that you can offer them now that you know what their needs are. And then spell it out. Spell out what the priorities are, who's going to do what, and when will it happen, and then follow through on that. Because I think if you want to engage anyone, especially young people, it's really important to follow through on that and deliver on what you said that you would do. And at the same time, work out any kinks along the way, because there will be some along the way, and it's part of the process of starting something new and learning new things. And be flexible. When you find out what the kinks are, be flexible in dealing with them and be willing to change. And then also, once you've found successes, to build out on those successes. Brag about them. Brag about what worked well and what you found out that was a key to get through to young people. And that invariably will help to expand efforts, and it'll grow. It'll take off just like a match and expand.
I do actually wholeheartedly agree with Carolyn and Eric, and actually wishing that I would have followed Eric to begin with, because so much of what both of them said is so true. I think the first thing, and I keep saying it over and over again, is the reaching out. But when you do reach out, make it meaningful. Make sure the commitment and the goal is clear, that we know what you're asking for is attainable, and you'd be surprised at what we would be able to deliver. As far as addressing the rampant cynicism, you'd be amazed at how many times I get asked that every single week. And I don't really believe, I see it every day, although I think I'm in denial. I refuse to believe that we are really all that cynical. I think Eric is completely right. We need to start becoming our own best cheerleaders with our governments, with our civic engagement, what we do to volunteer. I just think we need to start being proud about our communities and what we do.
Tom, before you ask your question, let me extend the invitation to ask questions to young visitors at this forum who are not yet City Club members. You should be part of this conversation too. Tom, carry on.
Tom Deering, a City Club member. There was a fair amount of emphasis, particularly at the start of your conversation, about the fact that people don't understand, younger people don't understand and haven't been exposed to information or to peer guidance or perhaps parental guidance or in civics and in their idea of our idea of what a citizen should be. Now, it's very easy to dump on the schools, and I don't want to just dump on the schools, but I'd like to ask whether you think that the way the schools approach teaching kids now does not do as good a job to indoctrinate, if you will, these values, or to expose them to the values that we're talking about, particularly in the area of a sense of civic responsibility.
I think that there was a period of time where what you're saying was true, and I think that a part of how we've ended up where we are is that it went from civics and citizenship being something that was overtly taught to something that was not overtly taught. But in recent years, there's been a huge, huge emphasis placed on service-based learning. And actually, I think a part of the reason that the Generation X is so engaged as volunteers is that service learning has become a part of the ethos within schools. I think we need to be more overt about the idea of citizenship and the idea of voting, but I actually think that there's been a big commitment made by educators to really have schools take on a more robust role and actually get people engaged in their community. And they're doing it not only by talking about it in the classroom, but by walking the walk and getting people out doing it in the community and having that be a part of the curriculum. So I think it's a place that they're actually starting to do an incredible job.
I agree with that too, but when you think about it, I mean, 20 years ago, when I was in elementary school, the problems that teachers and students that we faced are nothing compared to what they face now. I mean, I'm sure we had drugs and we had bullies on the playground, but when you've got kids packing guns to schools and kids that are homeless in even more numbers than they were when I was a child, that are wondering how they're going to survive from day to day. It's a real challenge to really feel that why I should be engaged, and the schools have a very difficult challenge in front of them, and sometimes I wonder if we do lay too much responsibility for having to learn our values and our civics at the foot of our schools, and I think they do a really wonderful job with the tools and the time that they have, but that's not to say there's not room for improvement.
My name is Andrew Rosenthal. I'm a senior at Lincoln, and I'm a member of the City Club's newly convened Task Force X. Don't know if you know about it. The goal of the group is to increase civic engagement among young people, if that is 16 and up or 18 and up. There's really no definite age limit. My question for you is, you talked about barriers to civic engagement or civic involvement, and we've identified some of the same barriers you have. What do you see as the first step in either breaking down those barriers or getting people involved? Is it changing the definition of civic engagement? Is it changing the issues that we focus on? What do you think should be done?
What I think should be done is we need, as a younger generation, we need to actually be active in that. We need to, while I do firmly believe there is a lack in mentorship and concrete programs for younger people to get involved, I think we also need to take a little bit of the responsibility ourselves and actually start knocking at those doors and demanding our place. I think that's the first step we need to start doing, is actually taking the onus on ourselves to say, well, they're not asking us to the table. I think I'm just going to pull up a chair.
And I think, yeah, I think that's great. And I think Laura brings up a good example is I think helping the youth to understand what potential they do have and what impact they truly do have on the outcome of some of these what might seem like very long-term decisions, and figure out what impact do I have as an individual and collectively as a group, and how can I make a difference? And to be able to define that, I think, is important as well.
My name is Ruth Curry, City Club member. Erica, you rang a bell with me right off the bat when you pointed out, how only 1 in 9 voted. I think our problem is, and you might talk about how this can be addressed. I think, looking back, I flashed on this when you raised that subject, that when I reviewed in my mind how the campaign went last time, there wasn't anything directed. There were issues that did impact young people and older people your age, but they weren't specified by the candidates to let you know that these were issues that were going to impact you when you got older. And there were very serious issues. I belong to an organization that's concerned about what happens to women when they get older. But when I talk to young women, I tell them there's none of these things can change without change in laws. And don't wait till you get gray hair like I have, because there's nothing that in the things that I'm working on that will make life better for me.
There's no doubt that there were that the issues facing our city, our state, and our country are absolutely relevant to the age group that we are talking about. They're relevant to everybody. And the policy choices that are being made and the choices of who runs things and the choices they make do impact our lives, literally oftentimes in life and death questions. There are thousands of 18-year-olds across this country this year who will age out of foster care. And before they graduate from high school, they will be homeless, they will have no medical insurance, they will have no support base, and how many of us in this room never even spoke to our parents again after the day we turned 18 and were completely, quote-unquote, self-supporting, and my guess is pretty few. So the issues that are facing us are absolutely relevant. The question is that the noise, the focus, the language, the stump speeches, the ads are not aiming at this audience group because this audience group is not the likely voter. And I believe when push comes to shove, smart campaign managers will continue to make that set of choices. So stealing from my other passion, the arts, I think there should be a 1% for the rest of us. And I'm wondering how many campaigns would be willing to commit to saying, okay, we will take 1% of the money we raise for this campaign, not just this candidate, but all the candidates running for the race, and we'll hand it over to X-PAC and say, you make sure young people hear about the issues and get out and vote, because we know we're going to put 99% of our effort and money into everybody else, but can we at least get 1%? Maybe that would help. I don't know.
Hi, my name is Marshall Runkle. Thanks to the City Club for putting this on. I think it's a great event. I've got a correction, though. Actually, well over 40% of young people voted in November. It's still not a respectable failing grade, but it's well better than 1 in 10. The 1 in 10 number is actually from the primary election the year in '98, I believe. But I've been running the numbers for the last, I guess, 4 cycles on young people's participation. And the most interesting thing that came out in November was there's now a plurality of young people who aren't registered either Democrat or Republican. So a majority of young people aren't affiliating with the major parties. And I think that that bodes ill both for the parties and I think for other institutions such as the City Club, that, I think it's a rational response of young people. They don't, I've never had, the Democratic Party has never sent me something and asked me what I thought. I've worked in Democratic politics my whole life, my whole professional life, and I haven't been asked one time, so, okay. That's it. I just wanted to make a correction, but I'm, that's all. I don't really have a question.
Actually, if I could respond to Marshall's statement, one, I appreciate the correction, and two, Marshall is correct. Many of us are relinquishing party politics. Myself, this last year, I decided to go without a party. I guess I resigned from my party. I was a committee precinct person. So, but the interesting part is that you raise is nobody called to ask me back, which I found really disturbing. I've spent a considerable amount of my life working for this particular party, and the fact that they lost a precinct person and it just didn't register with them, and I found that very disturbing. But I think younger people are finding that neither party are really resonating with them. The issues are not being framed in ways that are relevant to them, or maybe even that they understand how it has a direct impact on their lives. And I agree with you. I think it's going to bode very, very ill for our future if especially it's not resonating, it's not making sense to us, and when that happens, there's not really any active wooing back of people that are leaving parties in droves.
Hello, my name is Alex Lay. I'm not yet a City Club member. My question was, would any be opposed to the idea of imposing fines or some other form of taxation on those for not voting, as is done in Australia?
Just as I agreed with the statement that we don't want to have to rely upon incentives to convince people to be citizens, I don't think we need to rely on financial penalties for people not being. I would much prefer that as opposed to having an enforcement and punitive effort, that we were actually looking at making sure that there was relevancy, making sure there was access, and taking the action to go out and ask people to be involved. And I think we'd actually have a much greater response at half the cost of the cost of just collecting and processing those fines.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Mitsu Hideshi. I'm not a member. I wanted to bring up the issue mentioned before about being asked, and I think that I happen to know a lot of people who are in Generation X who are extremely active in their community. I mean, I know people who organize events, who are creating community, trying to get young people involved in making films or in trying to create little community spaces for people to meet each other and talk, and many, I mean, just a whole slew. I can just list them out. I mean, I'm sure you know about some of them, and Hands on Portland's one of them, and these are groups of people who are very committed to Portland, very committed to what's going on here, but I do see a disconnect between them and between sort of the official political system in the city. I don't really see these people even thinking that it's possible for them to participate, or even really conceiving of that as something that they could do. Everything that my friends do is just sort of independent on their own. We put up flyers. One of the things that really disturbed me was the attempt to Mayor Katz wants to eliminate postering on polls, and that would devastate a lot of the efforts that my friends are trying to organize. But it seemed like there was just no communication. Like, she doesn't seem to realize that there are all of these groups who rely on informal communication. And at the same time, I think that there are many things like this, and I had no idea this was going on until Elizabeth asked me to come. And, I asked another friend of mine to come, and she was interested, but, she had this attitude of, well, they're not interested in what I have to say. They're not interested in what I'm doing. And she was the editor of Anodyne, which was a monthly arts magazine. So she's very, committed to building the community here. So there are a lot of people who want to build and who want to participate, but I don't think that they're being asked. I don't think they really even realize that anyone cares about what they're doing, what they're interested in. And I thought I'd ask you to comment on that.
I do agree with you. I do agree with you on that. It's very, as I mentioned at the beginning, I think a lot of the established political leadership, albeit not all of them, and a lot of the organizations and mechanisms we have in this town don't really recognize the non-traditional ways in which we communicate with each other, whether it's the internet, whether it's postering, whether it's gathering, in a coffee shop and just starting a group right there. I think what we need to do is get out of our safe cubes and look and see what else is going on in there. And I think Carolyn said it earlier, as tough and as challenging as it can be, I think just asking what is going on, how if you're a part of a group or you're a politician, I think that you would be well served to actually ask a young person, how are you communicating with each other these days? Is there any place I can go to talk to you? Ask to come in. We're very friendly, and we would welcome you.
And the other piece to add to that is, as I mentioned before, follow through. In addition to asking, that's great. We'd be really happy to share information, but at the same time, we'd like to see results, and I think follow through is a very key piece of that as well.
Yeah, I apologize for us all commenting on one question, but I think there was another part of that question in terms of, are there two separate worlds? Is there the civic engagement and all these activities that are happening, and then there's all the city clubs and the chambers of commerce and the county commission, et cetera? And I think that both are really important, and that making sure that people are saying, hey, where are you communicating, and how are you communicating, and how do we get engaged is important. But I also think to have a sustainable community, we need to make sure that the boards of directors of all the major nonprofits in this town have people on them that are younger than the average age is today. And we need to make sure that every city-appointed commission and council and blue ribbon committee, every county-appointed and metro-appointed and state commission
How many people are appointed by the governor to state commissions that are under the age of 40? We need to make sure that both are happening, that the existing structures in the places where a huge number of the decisions are made actually have folks inside the tent and sitting at the table with voting rights.
I'm Andy Rumbach, the City Club intern this summer. I'm wondering if our definition of participation is flawed. I mean, we talk about voting, which is an irrational act, you know. Yet I see, I see thousands of protesters going to the streets with an issue, and the city government not responding. Why does participation need to be these classic sort of, you vote, you write a letter? Why does that have to define participation? And maybe are we trying to break through to you as a city?
I mean, I think you're right. I think we have to, I actually think we have to do both. I think that we have to rethink the paradigm and the systems of how we define civic engagement and how people are involved in community and how people will have voice in community. And at the same time, I think we actually have some systems and structures such as voting that have done amazing things and make a whole lot of sense and are really important and critical to the continuation of civilization as we want it to be, as opposed to as we know it. And we need to do a really better job of making sure that people participate in those structures as well, and that they know they're welcome and they know they're wanted.
While we're still on the air, and before your question, Barbara, which will come, I promise you, I'd like to ask the panel if they have any general conclusive or challenging comments to make as a consequence of what they've heard so far, and then perhaps we can resume with the questions.
Well, as opposed to a challenging comment, I guess I'd throw out a challenge. I think sitting in this room today and certainly listening and watching this forum is the means to make a radical change. The people in this room represent a huge amount of power. And that power is the power of the influence we have with our families, with our neighborhoods, with our churches, with our businesses. And I guess the challenge I'd throw out is let's not leave this City Club program the way many of us leave them, saying, wow, that was interesting. But saying, what am I specifically going to do about it within the next 7 days? And in terms of that, I'd like to throw out a challenge. I'd like each of us to ask the question and think of every engagement level you have, your job, your church, your school, your neighborhood, and say, what are we doing about this? And am I willing to commit that organization if I have the power to do so, or to be a liaison to work with that organization to commit it, to being a part of a renaissance of getting people engaged and connected in this community and bringing these different communities together. And I understand the City Club is willing to organize and coordinate bringing all of those organizations together, whether it be online or live for some conversations and forums, if within the next week you call the City Club and say, yes, my arts organization wants to be a part of the solution. Yes, my business wants to start supporting getting young professionals from our organization involved in the community, and we're willing to put our money where our mouth is, and we're willing to walk the talk. So it's a challenge I would issue.
To echo Eric's challenge is if we take some time to think about what would be the consequences of not doing that. Because it's pretty evident that the lack of civic engagement and the lack of contributing to your society as a youth very often means that later on you're more likely to be less engaged and participate less. So I think in addition to what Eric has said is to think about if for some reason I decide that I'm not able to do this, what are the consequences of that decision as well?
Exactly. And what I would like to throw back out there as another challenge, Eric had actually mentioned it earlier, and X-PAC does not necessarily need to be the recipient of the large S, although we would love it. I would like to throw out to people who are involved in political campaigns, whether you're a candidate, whether you're a manager, whether you're a volunteer, there's going to be a lot of money tossed around in the next gubernatorial race, in the next primary, in the next general election. I would really like to see between 2 and 5% aimed at young voters. And I don't mean a rally on a campus. I mean mail pieces, I mean advertisement, I mean real engagement. That's what I would like to see.